All right, let's now turn the page to the next portion of the Torah that we know as the book of Numbers. It's interesting that in the Jewish tradition, there are two titles. Some refer to this book in the wilderness, and that is the predominant title, and certainly gives us some idea of where these events take place, and a important reminder of Yahweh's judgment of Israel in the wilderness, which is a vital part in the middle section of this book in chapters 11 to 25. But also, because the first phrase, the first clause, and the Lord spoke to Moses. And we need to remember that as we come to Numbers, Israel, it's still at Sinai. And so in the same way that Leviticus begins on a note of the Lord calling Moses and speaking to him from the tent of meeting, that as we begin Numbers at Sinai, the Lord is still speaking to Moses. And of course, continues to speak to Moses even as they leave Sinai, go into the wilderness, and even as they come to the plains of Moab, that God is going to continue to speak to Israel. Now, it's interesting that the Lord spoke to Moses, and on the basis of what God tells Moses, it is significant as you go through the first 10 chapters. Now we have included a note of obedience. So in 154, thus the sons of Israel did, according to all the Lord had commanded Moses, so they did. And even as you come to chapter 10, that as Israel then sets out from Sinai, that they do exactly what the Lord had called them to do. And so they, 10:13, they moved according to the commandment of the Lord through Moses. And they set out in the order that had been established. Verse 28 of chapter 10. This was the order of march of the sons of Israel by which they set out. The result was, verse 34, the cloud of the Lord was over them by day when they set out from camp. And then it came about when the ark set out, Moses said, "Rise up, O Lord." And when it came to rest, he said, "Return, O Lord, to the myriad thousands of Israel." And it is significant that as we go through these first 10 chapters of Hebrews, we see the Lord speaking and Israel obeying. And of course, that all changes in chapter 11. It changes then through the middle part of the book. But we come to chapter 26. And the Lord spoke, verse 1, to Moses and to Eleazar, saying, "Take a census of all the congregation," just has been stated in chapter 1 previously with the previous generation. And again, we find Israel is obedient to what the Lord is speaking to Moses and what then Moses speaks to Israel. Israel once again becomes compliant, the second generation of Israel. So he spoke. And he spoke in the wilderness, first in the wilderness of Sinai. He continued to speak in the wilderness until Israel came to the plains of Moab. in chapter 22. But as far as overarching, all of Numbers and he spoke is actually a stronger title than in the wilderness. Now, we follow the Septuagint. We're not looking at Yahweh speaking to Moses, Moses speaking to Israel, and whether Israel obeys or disobeys, and where that took place. We call it, according to, obviously, the major event with which it begins, the book of Numbers. The first 4 chapters are different numberings that take place. Chapter 7, we see the numbers of the offerings that are brought to the tabernacle as it is erected by the individual tribes and added up. And of course, we see a renumbering that takes place in chapter 26. So it is true that as you go through this portion of the Torah, there are times when numberings take place, and not just the census that is given to us at the very beginning of the book. But since that is the hallmark, that's the beginning of this section, traditionally, of the Torah, you can see how the name Numbers becomes associated with the whole. Now, as we saw in the book of Leviticus, Numbers begins in chapter 1. The time is given as the first of the second month in the second year. So it's the first day, second month, second year. But we know that as we get into Numbers itself, that we have some chapters that then look back. And so I've given you a chart. There is a modified chart in the MacArthur Study Bible. There is also a modified chart in the Word and the World. In fact, I notice a number of the charts we've looked at are given in different ways in the World and the Word. But on page 235, you have Dr. Rassani's Chronology of Israel's Journey from Egypt to Canaan. So this is kind of a simplified, it is a version of what I have given you in your notes. But certainly when we get to chapter 7, verse 1, it came about on the day that Moses had finished setting up the tabernacle. We know from Exodus chapter 40, that's the first day of the first month of the second year. So now we are going back and filling in details, which again shows us that Leviticus and the first 10 chapters of Numbers are not necessarily in a strict chronological sequence. And certainly here, even if they were, if it's filling in information that is taking place in that first month through the first day of the second month of that second year, now we're going back in chapter 7. And so chapter 7 deals with the first month. And then we also have in chapter chapter 9 we have the account of the second Passover. The Passover now, first Passover that took place after Egypt. Remember, the first Passover was in Egypt. Second Passover was at Sinai, but it takes place on the evening of the 14th day of the first month. So again, there's a reminder that what is given to us in chapter 7 and in chapter 9 is a part of that first month. And the offerings and the cloud, the trumpets, all are tied in to the erection of the tabernacle, the second Passover. And then we have the events that take place in at least the first 4 chapters, the numberings, and very possibly the giving of the laws that are also in chapters 5 and 6 as well. And then chapter 9 tells about a second, what happens now. Now you got Leviticus. What happens if someone's unclean on the day of Passover? Now, we don't have any evidence of Israel doing this any other time in the future, but at Sinai, those who are unclean could not participate in the official Passover. There was a second Passover a month later. So say a lady had given childbirth and was in an unclean status, right? But in the following 30 days, she was able to, be cleansed, bring, the turtle doves, send burnt offering, and now she's in a clean relationship. Now she can participate in Passover. What about a man that had a seminal emission, the night before the Passover? Sorry, but a month from now, all right, they could come and have the Passover. So this is now all tied into the fact that Israel is very, very aware of what it meant to be clean and unclean before the Lord and what that meant. So that is evident as we read Numbers chapter 9. And so all the way through chapter 10, we're into the second month, and Israel departing from Sinai and journeying the rest of that month and into the third month to Kadesh. Kadesh, from where? In Numbers chapter 13, the spies are sent out, and the spies spy out the land for 40 days, for a month and 10 days, and then return with their report. And Israel rejects on the basis of that report going into the land. And the Lord says, not this generation. And so really from the 7th month, basically, of the second year through the 39th year, that is for 37 and a half years, all we know is the narrative of the events that take place in those 5 chapters from Numbers 15 to Numbers 19. But once again, might not be in strict chronological sequence, but it's very, very interesting how little revelation is given concerning those 37 and a half years. A lot is given about the second year, and then when we get to chapter 20 on, a lot is given about the 40th year, but very, very little in comparison about the time that first generation of Israel found themselves dying off in the wilderness and bringing to conception, birth, and nurturing the second generation that was to go into the land. Then as you continue on through Numbers, chapters 20 to 36, things pick up as we really deal with the first 10 months of the 40th year in these chapters. And beginning with the death of Miriam and the rebellion of Moses and Aaron, that takes place in the first month. And then Israel starts to journey. And in the 4th month, Aaron dies. A whole month is given for Aaron's mourning. And then further travels to and victories in Transjordan that bring Israel to the plains of Moab, where they will make their final preparations for Canaan. And in the Lord's plan, the most important of those preparations are the final speeches of Moses that begin on the first day of the 11th month of the 40th year, that have been collected for us in what we call Deuteronomy. And at the end of those speeches, Moses dies. Wouldn't you like to do? Wouldn't you like to be a Moses? You preach, and then you die. All right, you have a month of preaching, and then you die, go to be with the Lord. I mean, that's Moses. I mean, that's George Whitefield. Gets up, preaches, and goes back, lays in bed, and dies. Isn't that the way you want to go? I mean, you want to go. I mean, the day before you die, you want to be preaching. All right. So one day you're preaching, and the next day you're in the presence of the Lord. That's what every preacher should aspire to. So, and actually, there's been men who died in the pulpit. Be one of those. I mean, literally be preaching, and the next minute, what you're preaching about becomes reality. So, I mean, who wants to die in a hospital? Moses didn't die in a hospital. Whitefield didn't die in a hospital. Don't die in a hospital. All right. Tell them, get me out of this hospital. Let me preach one more sermon, then I'll go. All right, that's not the application. What we see in the end of the Torah, but it's exciting though to think about it. So this is a month of preaching, and then he dies in a month of mourning, and then Israel is ready to go into the land. And so you can see that really Deuteronomy really adds nothing. As far as major narrative movements, but it is the culmination of the Torah, and we'll introduce ourselves to Deuteronomy next week. All right, so here is the basic chronology through the 10th month of the 40th year, as far as what we see in Numbers. And then, of course, you can take a look at the history of the interpretation of Numbers. And as we start to dig into the book, a certain amount of confusion on what is Numbers all about. And many times that, again, is because exegetes come to the book of Numbers independent of what is in the rest of the Torah. All right, but let's think in terms. Okay, let me just ask you if there's any questions. While I'm seeing if there's any questions, since I just gave you the chronology, I'd like to very quickly, from the study Bible, give you again the geography of where these things are taking place. But any questions? All right, seeing none. Let's think in terms of where these events that I've just narrated take place. I'm looking for the first map, which is not where it's supposed to be. All right, they had been at Sinai, and all right, let's I'll begin by looking back at the map of the Exodus. Yep, this is where Dr. MacArthur gets us to Kadesh Barnea. So this is the map. This is the map we looked at last week. All right, as we thought in terms of the route of the Exodus, and of course we just got to Sinai. Now, from Sinai, in chapters 10 through 12, Israel journeys. They journey up the east side of the Sinai Peninsula, through the wilderness of Paran, and come in the wilderness of Zin to Kadesh Barnea, which is on the southern boundary of the land of Canaan. All right, it's here where the spies are sent north into the land and return. And it is from this southern point that the failed invasion of the land takes place in Numbers chapter 14. This is when God said, okay, you're going to die in the wilderness. Israel didn't like that, and so now they finally have faith. Well, let's go in and conquer the land, and of course they are defeated by Amorites. They're in this southern part of the land, pushed back. And so it's around this area that Israel wanders, which basically means the tabernacle is here, and the order that is seen around the tabernacle falls apart for those 37 and a half years until they come back together in the 40th year. And then they move back down to the Gulf of Aqaba, to Ezion Geber, right? And it's here as they're moving that Aaron dies in Numbers chapter 21. But they move south so they can then move around Edom and come around Moab to what is known as the plains of Moab. So that second part of the journey is given later on in the book of Numbers. All right, here we go. Okay, the last part. And it's interesting that they come to the plains of Moab in chapter 22. That's why this is not quite where it should be. But here's the last movements. All right, after the death of Aaron and coming back down the Gulf of Aqaba, now they move to the east. All right, and do not go through Edom, but come around Edom. And as you can see, come around Moab into what is known as the plains of Moab. And let me just blow that up a little bit, for you, and realize I'm a little off because of the machine. But this is where they find themselves in this territory that had been taken previously from the Moabites by the Canaanites. All right, and that's given to you both in Numbers and again in the Deuteronomy chapter 2. And so they come around Moab. Remember that they could not take any land, could not go through the land of the Edomites. They turned them back, turned them away. So they have to go around and come to the plains of Moab. And that is territory that they have taken from Sihon and Og, Amorites who have previously taken it from the Moabites. All right, so that helps to give you some conception of not only the what, but also the where. All right, any questions on the introductory material? Let's talk about some of the themes that we find in Numbers. And of course, the theme of wilderness is a major theme. The term wilderness is found 48 times in Numbers, 57 times in the rest of the Torah. So the predominant use of the term wilderness is in this portion of the Pentateuch. And as we said, all the way through chapter 21, Israel is in the wilderness. Then finally, when they come to chapter 22, they camp in the plains of Moab beyond the Jordan, opposite Jericho, and that's where they're going to stay through the rest of the narrative of the Torah. It's where we're going to find them still camped as we begin the book of Joshua and the former prophets. So the wilderness has come to an end. Yet significantly, Israel continues in Numbers to look back to events that took place in the wilderness. For instance, in chapter 26, after the numbering has taken place, verse 63, these are those who were numbered by Moses and Eleazar the priest, who numbered the sons of Israel in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho. But among these there was not a man of those who were numbered by Moses and Aaron the priest, who numbered the sons of Israel in the wilderness of Sinai. Notice the wilderness in Sinai is something in the past. This numbering is very clearly delineated. It's different from. And not a single man was numbered in this census that was numbered in chapter 1. Why? Verse 65, for the Lord had said to them, they shall surely die in the wilderness. And not a man was left of them except Caleb and Joshua. So you can see that that the wilderness is clearly looked at as in the past, all the way through Numbers 34, which gives us the divisions of the land. And notice in verse 3, your southern sector shall extend from the wilderness of Zin, that is the border of the land, and your southern border shall extend from the end of the Salt Sea eastward. And so it's going around. So the wilderness to the south is outside the land. And so the wilderness was a place where Israel was. Not after 26, a place where they are, actually from 22 on, a place where they are, nor a place to which they're going to return. As they go into the land, the borders of the land are north of the wilderness where Israel found themselves the previous generation, where they died out. So the wilderness is an important theme where Israel was, and an area to which Israel is not going to return. Now, more than the place, the major theme of Numbers is what took place in the wilderness. And of course, what took place in the wilderness was rebellion. Out and out defiant disobedience of the Lord. And a number of different terms are used, interestingly, leading up to this concept of rebellion. Rebellion is not the first term used. Interestingly, in Numbers chapter 11, it begins on the note of complaint. Israel complains. In fact, it was a number of people. The people became like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them, that consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. By the way, it is going to be consistent that these acts are going to be met with the Lord's anger. But in chapter 11, it is complaint, followed by weeping. That begins in verse 4. And the rabble who were among them had a greedy desire, and the sons of Israel wept again. Now, weeping here has the idea of bewailing their circumstances. So, it begins with complaint, and then the rabble, that is, those who had joined themselves with Israel, they had these greedy desires that want meat to eat. You know, we've had a year of nothing but manna. Manna. Many times I say the most popular cookbook, you know, for Israel for 40 years is 101 ways to fix manna. All right, every wife had to have one because day in and day out they got manna. All right, and the husband came home and said, I've had this for the last 10 days. All right, well, you're having it again. It's all the Lord has given to us. So manna. And so they want meat. This rabble, this group of non-Israelites that have joined with Israel leaving Egypt back in Exodus chapter 12. They become the ones who begin, no pun intended, stirring the pot for meat. Who's going to give us meat to eat? And so they have the greedy desires, and this penetrates into Israel. Yeah, we deserve some meat. And so they start to bewail the fact that there's no meat. Who's going to give us meat? And this bewailing, you know, is something that continues to be directed toward the Lord. And notice in verse 10, now Moses heard the people weeping, bewailing their situation throughout their families, each man in the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly, and Moses was displeased. Notice bewailing is met with the Lord's anger. So they complain, they bewail their situation, they cry out loudly. They're still weeping as we come to chapter 14 after they hear the report, the evil report of the 10 spies, and all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. And then they add to it 14:2, and the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. So from complaining to bewailing to grumbling. And they grumbled against the Lord. And then finally in chapter 14, verse 9, Joshua and Caleb try to stop the rebellion of the people. They want to get rid of Moses and Aaron and get a new leader who's going to lead them back to Egypt. 14:9, they call the people as they come toward Moses and Aaron. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they shall be our prey. So complaining, bewailing, grumbling, that becomes out and out defiance against Yahweh. And of course, don't rebel. Don't be defiant in this way against the Lord. But that's exactly what the people do. And once again, even though the Lord is slow to anger, that's as on the basis of which Moses can come and seek the Lord's forgiveness, the Lord's pardon. But the Lord is once again angry because of the actions of the people. It's interesting when the Lord himself speaks in 14:11. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will this people spurn me? Now, Joshua and Caleb had used the word rebel. Yahweh uses the word spurn. Look at me with disdain and turn away from me. How long will they spurn me? How long will they not believe in me? Why don't they put their trust in me? Why don't they lean upon who I am and what I have said? How come they cannot take at face value the promises that I have given to them? How long will they not believe in me despite all the signs which I have performed in their midst? Now, rather than saying the anger of the Lord, because it's not descriptive, but Moses goes on to say how the Lord's anger will be seen. I will smite them with the pestilence and dispossess them. And I will make you, Moses, into a nation greater and mightier than they. And this becomes a second test of Moses, just as in chapter 32 with the gold of Exodus, golden calf incident. All right, Moses, I'll start all over again with you. Moses has to remember, well, do that. What's your testimony going to be among the nations? And obviously this is a test to see how Moses will respond. And Moses responds properly. He says, Lord, don't do this. Remember your promise to this people. Remember the testimonies will be the nations if you allow this to take place. Rather, as a God slow to anger, abundant in loyalty, forgiving iniquity and transgression. Forgive them. Pardon, I pray, the iniquity of this people. So, verse 20, the Lord says, I pardon them. But my glory will be seen throughout the earth. And these men have seen my glory, my signs in Egypt, in the wilderness. They put me to the test. Therefore, even though there is forgiveness, the consequence is what? They will die. They were concerned about their children dying in the wilderness. They'll die in the wilderness. I'll take their children into the land. So as a reminder that even though sin can be forgiven, there are still consequences, and there are grave consequences, obviously, for Israel. Now in chapters 15 to 17, did Israel's heart change? No. You come to chapter 17, verse 10. The Lord himself calls the Israelites rebels. This is when they have argued against Aaron. Why does Aaron get to be the priest? And God shows through the budding of Aaron's rod that he is the one that's been chosen. And the Lord said in verse 10, put back the rod of Aaron before the testimony to be kept as a sign against the rebels. All right, so keep that rod, the budded, put it next to the testimony, to the ark of testimony, as a continual reminder to Israel of their rebellion against me, that you may put an end to their grumblings against me, so that they should not die. All right, so let this be a reminder of rebellion. And of course, rebellion continues on against Yahweh. This generation, the wilderness, showed their great rebellion. That's why I start chapter 14. But obviously continues to rebel against the Lord. They complain against Moses. They complain against the Lord. They complain against Aaron. And then in chapter 20, ultimately, Moses and Aaron join their company. Sad fact, sad reality, that in the 40th year, first month of 40th year, that Moses and Aaron fall into rebellion as well. This, and there's a certain, level of empathy for Moses. He has put up with this people now for 39 years, is into his 40th year. And we've already seen that, nothing really changes during that 37 and a half years. These people who complained and bewailed their situation, grumbled and rebelled against the Lord, as they come into that second year into the wilderness on their way to Canaan, continue to, rebel against the Lord, rebel against Moses during that whole time. And now we come to, the first month, 40th year. And again, there's no water for the congregation. Just like Exodus chapter 15. And so the people contended with Moses, verse 3, and spoke, saying, if only we'd perish when our brothers perish before the Lord. By the way, that goes back to chapter 16. The rebellion of Dothan, Korah. Hey, I wish when the ground had opened up and swallowed them, it would have swallowed us too. Boy, what a thing to want. Pray when the rebels were cut off, we've been among them. Well, don't worry. You're going to find out. If only we perish when our brothers perish. Why then have you brought the Lord's assembly into this wilderness? For us and our beasts to die. Why have you made us come up from Egypt to bring us to this wretched place? It's not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there water to drink. I mean, they are in the wilderness. Less than 2 inches of rain a year. So unless there's subterranean water, basically, you've got sand, desert, wilderness. And that's where you brought us. No, Moses brought them out of Egypt to go to Canaan. So stubborn rebellion is why they've now spent the last 37 and a half years eating sand. They haven't been eating it, but but there's no water. So Moses came into the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting, fell on their faces. They come to the doorway of the tabernacle. The glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, assemble the congregation, speak to the rock before their eyes, that it may yield its water. Thus you shall bring forth water for them out of the rock, and let the congregation and the beast drink. Now God is very clear. Speak to the rock. But what had he said when Israel needed water in chapter 17 of Exodus? Don't speak to the rock, but strike it. And strike it how many times? Strike the rock, water came forth. This time, instead of striking the rock, they are to speak to the rock. So Moses took the rod from before the Lord just as he had commanded him. So far, so good. Now things go south. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock, and he, that is Moses, said to them, listen now, you rebels, you defiant, disobedient Israelites. Shall we bring forth water for you out of the rock? Moses takes it personally, doesn't he? By the way, gentlemen, many, many times when the people of the Lord rebel and you are the Lord's representative and you have to, as it were, take their complaining, their bewailing of their situation, their grumbling, like Moses, you can start to say, you want me to do something about it? Yahweh said he would do something about it. You see, Moses here is taking it personally. Listen now, you rebels, shall we bring forth water from out of the rock? And in an act of his own rebellion, Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. Now we can all empathize with the frustration. God doesn't empathize at all. This is just as blatant rebellion against Yahweh as what Israel did at Kadesh Barnea. God gave his word. This is the land before you. Spy it out, see it's a good land, then go in. Spies come back, it's a good land, but we can't take it. The people rebel, they refuse to do what God says. Out and out rebellion against Yahweh. Now the same thing for Moses and Aaron. Out and out rebellion. God has commanded, he has said exactly what to do. And Moses does the exact opposite. Strikes the rock twice with his rod. And notice water came forth abundantly. It was God's plan all along that the people would receive water. Moses has used the inappropriate means, but God has supplied. Because that was God's plan. And so the congregation of the beasts drank the water that came forth. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me. By the way, notice that's exactly what Yahweh said about Israel in chapter 14. How long will they not believe me? Moses and Aaron have committed the exact same sin as Israel at Kadesh Barnea. So what is God's punishment? What was God's punishment to those who rebelled at Kadesh Barnea? You shall not go into the land. What is the punishment, therefore, for Moses and Aaron? Because you did not believe me to treat me as holy, as set apart in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. Those were the waters of Meribah, because the sons of Israel contended with the Lord, and he proved himself holy among them. But not only did Israel contend with the Lord, but also who contended against the Lord, who also put themselves in opposition to the Lord, Moses and Aaron. And therefore they're going to reap the same consequences as the people they have led. So that's why I start chapter 20 as well. Chapter 21, the people still don't get their lesson. They continue. Even as God starts to give them victory in their conquests. Now in 21:4, the people became impatient because of the journey. And the people spoke against God and Moses. And so God sends fiery serpents. They come to the plains of Moab. And in chapter 25, we have the final and culminating sin of the wilderness generation. And this is where we have once again idolatry. 25:3, the people join themselves to Baal of Peor. By the way, that's the first time the word Baal is used in the Old Testament, but it won't be the last. They have now come in contact with the Canaanites, and the predominant gods of the Canaanites were known as the Baals, the Baals, the lords of the storm. That was the predominant god within the pantheon of the Canaanite gods. And it seems as though Baal had, representatives in different places. This is the Baal from Peor. And once again, the Lord was angry against Israel. So by the way, notice the progression. Complaining, bewailing, grumbling, out and out rebellion, spurning the Lord, not believing in him. Complete and total disobedience, which finally swallows even the leaders, Moses and Aaron themselves, who rebel. To impatience, complaining that the journey is too long, we're not getting there fast enough. To finally, on the very borders of the land of Canaan, going into complete and total apostasy. Joining themselves, at least a portion of Israel, joining themselves with idols, and God sends in his anger, his final judgment, the plagues. In verse 9, those who died by the plague were 24,000. 600,000. And so, once again, and going back to 25:3-4, what was the Lord's response? The Lord's response when Israel joined themselves to Baal, the Lord was angry against Israel. Anger, chapter 11, against their complaining, their bewailing, anger against their grumbling, anger against their rebellion, anger against their apostasy, their idolatry. And yet, significantly, this is it. That with this final judgment, chapter 26, a census can be taken because the first generation, except obviously at this point for Moses, is now no longer, and Joshua and Caleb are going to go into the land. A new census can be taken, and the second generation of Israel can now be prepared to go into the land. But what a sorrowful end to the first generation. With complaining that leads to rebellion, that consummates itself in idolatry, continually met with the Lord's anger that brings forth his judgment, though yet also his grace that pardons in response, to Moses' request for forgiveness in chapter 14, that spares the plague any further because of Phinehas standing in the gap in chapter 25, zeal for the Lord, putting to death the man who was overtly sinning in this case, again stopping the plague of the Lord. That there is also in the book of Numbers an emphasis upon God being slow to anger, and being loyal, and being gracious, and being merciful. Don't miss that. So sometimes people read through this middle section of Numbers and think, oh, the harshness of Yahweh. Man, the harshness of Yahweh would have been if he would have destroyed them all in the wilderness, and there would not have been a second generation. They would have just been left to die there. And God was under no compulsion other than the promise he had made to Abraham to fulfill his own promise and word that he had given. And how do I know that? Because I've read the Balaam oracles, and we'll look at that as well. It's only the Abrahamic promise that saved Israel in the wilderness. God was bound by that covenant oath. And so we not only see certainly God's anger leading to judgment, we also see God's grace leading to the second generation of Israel being protected and being able to go into the land. So very quickly then, the wrath of God toward the disobedient people, we've already brought that up. And yet the blessing of God through Balaam, we'll look at that. The numbers, which remind us of the glory and grace of Yahweh. He took care of them and protected them, and frankly, 1,800 less from the census in chapter 1 to chapter 26. Gentlemen, that's grace. If I'd have been God, if you'd have been God, all right, we would remember our promises, but okay, 600,000 fighting men, you'll be down to 6,000 by the time I'm through with you. No, God graciously basically restored a man for man. And so the old and the new, and Yahweh's patience, and waiting for one generation to die, another generation to come. And of course, the whole focus upon the land. Significantly, the census was taken in chapter 1 so that Israel might have a fighting force to go on the land. Chapter 26, they might also be fighters, but also, as we've seen, this became the basis of the inheritance as well. But the whole concept, why do you need to know your fighting men? Because they're going to go in and take the land. And so the land is the focus throughout the book of Numbers. All right, any questions about the themes? All right, yeah.
When you're talking about the people getting the first plan and they're getting meat to eat, when did the meat initially stop? Because back in
Exodus
Exodus 16.
When did the meat stop? It seems as though chapter 16 is just a one-time occurrence, where again they complained because of no meat, and so God sent the quail, and the same thing here. Yeah, they complain, and so God sends the quail, and now the distinction is, and the quail, becomes a curse to them, because God gave them what they desired, and what they desired was not good for them. Now, obviously, they also have animals, and here's the wonderful thing: if they were in harmony with Yahweh, they could have had all the meat they wanted. Remember Leviticus 3, Leviticus 7, the sacrifice of peace offerings. If you're in peace with Yahweh, you bring your offering, and hey, a whole slab of the meat comes back, and you got 2 days to eat it. You want meat? Well, let there be harmony between Yahweh and Israel. And you can have all the meat from all the animals that God has provided for you. So really, why is it they have no meat? Well, because they are not actively having fellowship with Yahweh through the sacrifice of peace offerings. And you might say, well, man, they've been sinning so much, all the animals have been consumed, with their sin and guilt offerings, with their burnt offerings. And yeah, and again, these are questions. I don't know how many animals they had, and how plentiful their herds and flocks were, in the wilderness. Kind of hard when you don't have a whole lot of food, a whole lot of water. But it's interesting, Deuteronomy 8, God took care and fed them. And we assume also he took care and fed their animals and their flocks and herds as well. So, to what extent did they even avail themselves of the tabernacle that was in their midst? I've been set up, I've been functioning for about 6 months before the rebellion at Kadesh Barnea, but I think after that it's pretty much a realization that they didn't do much with the tabernacle at all. They were no longer, and we'll talk a little bit about what the wandering I think looked like, and it's not that they just took off and where are we going. They just the organization fell apart, and then it came back together in the 40th year. So that would be my answer to Exodus chapter 16. Exodus was a one-time event, and that's why about a year later they're still complaining because they want meat. But in the meantime, my answer is God's given them a way to have all the meat they want to eat. Just be in harmony with me and enjoy the peace offering. Okay. Sometimes, though, Yahweh's solutions aren't the ones we want. All right, any other questions?
When I just think of numbers, one verse that typically comes to mind is Numbers 32:23b, where it says, "Be sure your sin will find you out."
Mm-hmm. It did.
In the context of what Numbers 32 is talking about, you look at that mainly as applied to the children of Israel. You see that as a general principle.
Well, and the idea of Numbers 32 is that principle, your sin will find you out. Obviously, within that context, it refers to Israel. All right, you can't, God is going to deal with you, and He knows the inside as well as the outside, and so this principle, of course, is not only just stated, but it's stated throughout the Old Testament and New Testament in different ways. But certainly the context within Torah is just a reminder of Israel. And certainly, once again, reflecting upon, what we read in Numbers, it's a great reminder that God deals with sin in His people. And sin brings about the complaining all the way through the rebellion, all through the idolatry, and that angers the Lord. The Lord is angered by the sin of His people and he responds. He responds with judgment. Yet, when there is an appeal for forgiveness, the glory of Numbers is, as with the rest of Scripture, he also responds in mercy and grace. So, but you're right. I mean, if you can't go through Numbers, in fact, throughout the years, the students have said the most frustrating part of the Torah is Numbers. It's about the middle of the book of Numbers, you want to strangle Israel. Come on, get with it. Can't you? You know, how long is this sin and rebellion going to take place? How long are you going to, test the long suffering of the Lord? Until you start to realize, hey, we're just like Israel. But there's a certain sense in which the same frustration that I think is implicit in Moses' action in Numbers chapter 20 is about, by the time you get to the end of Numbers 19, the same frustration you feel about Israel as you're reading, as you're hearing the Torah. And more than one, student has told me, I got frustrated with Israel until I realized I'm just like Israel. Then I went back and rejoiced in the fact that God's grace was also extended to Israel, as a reminder that God's grace is also extended to me. So it's interesting that in many ways the most neglected part of the Torah in the study of the Pentateuch in both Christian and Jewish circles, which is this wilderness this wilderness narrative, particularly in Numbers 11 through 25, has a lot to say. And interestingly, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, when Paul talks about that which happened as an example to us upon whom the end of the ages have come, notice how he goes back to Numbers 11 to 25 for his illustrations of what we should take heart, those of us, those Corinthian believers, and those of us like the Corinthian believers. These happen as examples for us as well. That we should not test the Lord, that we should, believe the Lord and not spurn him and turn away. So, he could have gone anywhere within the Torah, but he reminded, of all people, the Corinthians. When you get into 1 Corinthians, you can realize why the Corinthians, of all believers in the New Testament, even remind you of how God dealt with Israel in Numbers 11 through 25. So I'm on good biblical warrant to say there's good preaching material in these chapters, 11 to 25. Because Paul said there's good preaching material, good things to remember for those of us who are this side of the cross.